Good afternoon. I am Marcia Davis. I am Dean of the College of Public Health, and it is my honor today to introduce our speaker today as part of Ethics Awareness Week. This week has been designated by the University System of Georgia across all USG institutions as an important reminder of our shared core values of integrity, excellence, accountability, and respect. This afternoon, Dr. Jim Lavery will speak on transforming the ethics of global health through stakeholder engagement and organizational learning. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Office, the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, and the Global Health Institute in the College of Public Health. So Dr. Lavery said its introduction was too long, but I think it's worthy of hearing all of his accomplishments. He is the inaugural Conrad N. Hilton Chair in Global Health Ethics, professor in the Hubert Department of Global Health in the Rollins School of Public Health, and faculty of the Ethics Center. Prior to joining the Emory faculty, he was a research scientist and managing director of the Center for Ethical, Social, and Cultural Risk at the Shing Knowledge Institute of St. Michael's Hospital, and associate professor in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, Institute of Medical Science, and Joint Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. Dr. Lavery received his master's and doctoral degrees from the Institute of Medical Science and Center for Bioethics at University of Toronto, and held a postdoctoral fellowship in applied ethics and health policy at the Queen's University Health Policy Research Unit. He then spent 3 years at the Fogarty International Center and Warren G. Magnuson Clinical Center Department of Clinical Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. From 2005 to 2015, he was co-principal investigator of the Ethical, Social, and Cultural Program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Global Health and Global Development Programs. He is currently leading the development of a global learning platform for community and stakeholder engagement to support funders and implementation partners in global health and global development in partnership with the Gates Foundation. He's also an associate of the Council on Health Research for Development in Geneva, a technical advisor for its Research Fairness Initiative, and a member of the Bioethics Advisory Panel of Pfizer. Help me welcome Dr. Lavery to the stage.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Dean Davis, for that extraordinarily lengthy introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here on this absolutely gorgeous historic campus. Thank you to my wonderful hosts this morning for a really lovely set of discussions. And thank you all for senior leadership, I think, for coming today. I really appreciate you being here. Before I start, let me flip over to the title slide. You know, there's a saying that if you want me to talk for an hour, give me a week to prepare, and if you want me to talk for half an hour, give me 2 weeks to prepare. And as I was talking with Chris, who's not here with us today, you know, I thought, I really have a kind of story that I wanted to try to connect together. And I was telling these guys this morning, when I started to put it together, it was about 2.5 hours long. And I thought, okay, I got to pull a lot out. So we're going to have more of a sort of 35,000 foot level view of some of the things that I've been involved in that I think speak to some of the issues that you guys are trying to celebrate here with Ethics Week. And congratulations on that, by the way. Okay, let me start with an overview of how I sort of see at least part of the problem that I think we're trying to grapple with, at least in global health. So the global health enterprise presents what I think of as a kind of infinitely complex set of ethical challenges. And these occur in places that we don't often look at in public health, like international relations and governance, policy, programming, financing. But we really have only a couple of prominent, what I think of as modes of practice of ethics. One is the human subjects paradigm. If you tell someone that you work in ethics, they're like, oh, are you on the IRB? And it's like, well, I used to be, but there are other aspects of ethics as well. And the other really dominant mode, I think, is this broad critiques of the global order and its implications for global health, with a particular focus on more recent history in neoliberalism, and then deeper history in decolonization, which has really become a major thrust in global health. So these modes of practice of ethics, I think, are mostly remote from the deeper ethical challenges in global health that I think are pervasive in what we do. And part of the argument I want to sort of present here is that I think we failed to establish ethics and ethical reasoning as an essential strategic problem-solving tool for global health challenges. So that's kind of a current that hopefully you'll see reflected in what we do. So I think we don't have the right tools. And when we start working, and I'm not sure how well you can see these, but this is a study that we did with the senior leadership at the Task Force for Global Health in Atlanta, where we met with all of them and we were trying to get a handle on how they encountered issues in their work. And they didn't have problems with biostatistics. They had problems with trying to discern the correct, appropriate ethical approach to the complex challenges that they faced every day as leaders of these difficult programs. So, second part of the overview then is just kind of give you a little bit of a historical review, actually, of some of the work that I've done thinking in this way forward. And yes, that is Sisyphus there, and that's kind of what it feels like a lot to work in this field, fully intentional. I want to start with, as Dean Davis alluded to in the introduction, to some lessons I think that I learned from the Ethical, Social, and Cultural Program for Global Health that we manage for the Gates Foundation. And then I want to talk about this concept, really. It's still haven't developed it too much into a program yet, but the human engagement learning platform that we're trying to organize some thinking around at Emory. And then share with you just briefly some of the current directions and reflections that I'm sort of doing in my work. Okay, so lessons from the Ethical, Social, and Cultural Program for Global Health. Well, back in 2005, Peter Singer and I were the co-PIs on a $10 million grant with the Gates Foundation to help them address ethical, social, and cultural issues related to the Grand Challenges in Global Health initiative that they were just launching, which at the time was about a $500 million initiative and eventually grew into about a $1 billion initiative. And at the time, we were trying to explain to them how we thought that program should be structured, and in particular, some of the problems with previous programs that we thought we might be able to improve upon. I had just come from NIH, so I was kind of familiar with a lot of the ELSI programs, the Ethics, Law, and Social Implications programs, and those were the Human Genome Project with the HapMap project and the National Nanotechnology Initiative. And some of these problems were that there was a blurry mandate. That was James Watson, who's the former director of the Human Genome Institute. And he said, it's a blurry mandate, these ELSI programs, but it kept us from being attacked. Okay, honesty is important. Also talked about having arbitrary budgets. The ELSI program for the Human Genome Project was 5% of the overall operating costs. And it was just arbitrary. There wasn't a good basis for what value that was going to create for the 5%. A lot of the work that was done, some very important work, some very good work, but it was all done essentially remote from the science, from the development and the implementation of the science. And there really was a limited range of perspectives reflected. And we argued in this paper that we really need to draw on theoretical perspectives that sit outside the traditional community of ELSI researchers. And overall as well, there was poor representation of low and middle income country, interests and perspectives in those programs. So we had two main objectives in this program. The first one was to provide an advisory service for the Grand Challenges in Global Health projects on ethical, social, and cultural issues that they encountered in the short to midterm. And then objective number two was a kind of knowledge generation objective. We thought that if we were going to be hanging out and learning from these encounters that we could publish some work to kind of further further the appropriate adoption of some of the technologies that were being developed through the GCGH program. And to put that into some context, we did over 150 consults, and I'll share a few of them with you in a few minutes. And we published, I think, between 80 and 100 papers out of this program. So we felt a fair obligation with $10 million to do something over the 6 years initially with that money. So we think we actually did a lot. Really still unsure about the impact, but I'll come back to that in a second. So now, retrospectively, looking back after the first round of that, we published another paper where we tried to describe a bit what we had done. And really what we said is that we had tried to integrate this ESC consultation service with the scientific endeavor. We were interested in working with the scientists where they were working, and again, I'll show you some examples. We really tried hard to privilege Southern perspectives. We had at least 4 or 5 people on our team living in the South, living in Ghana, India, South Africa. They were part of our team, and we did a lot of work together. And then the third thing that we tried to do was build on specific cases that we encountered with the development of these technologies, and then to try to identify and propose solutions to cross-cutting issues that may be related to those specific cases. So to try to build out. So for example, this idea about promoting respect in this kind of work through building effective and ethical community engagement strategies, or filling gaps in regulation or governance or policies or guidelines that we encountered as we were doing this work, or to promote and facilitate responsible partnerships with the private sector. This was particularly important because these technologies were mostly on commercialization streams, which was part of the purpose of the grand challenges. And then finally, we tried very hard actually to evaluate our strategies and activities and outcomes, and it proved to be really, really difficult. So that's something that we felt like we didn't solve, but we made a fairly good effort to do that. So let me just share a few examples to make this a bit more concrete. So I was in the hall one day in Seattle, and someone from the vaccine team stopped me and said, look, what responsibilities do we have as a foundation to ensure that new vaccines in our pipeline with all of our vaccine development partners conform to halal requirements? So, anyone in the audience who's got any background in ethics, the answer is, I have no idea. No idea what that is, but we'll work with you. And that's a good example about how we work with them. We did a bit of a deep dive in this, looked at some really, really interesting aspects of Sharia law and science, and gave them a report. Tachi Amada, who was the president of Global Health for a long time and a real advocate for what we were doing, a real champion. He died a few years ago, a really lovely person. But he stopped us at a meeting one day and he said, is it ever ethical to stop an entire platform of clinical trials, to stop them early if they're not producing useful results? And this was very much tied to microbicide and PrEP trials that were really coming up with a lot of money, but really coming up with kind of null outcomes. A lot was being learned, but they weren't moving forward, and Bill Gates was particularly concerned that that money might be better used elsewhere. We wrote an argument about where it might be useful to entertain opportunity costs as a reason to stop early, in addition to the traditional efficacy, safety, and futility. And then David Buchanan, who was a friend of mine from NIH, he was a peer reviewer and slammed it with a 16-page rebuttal. And then we sent 17 pages back to him. And so Gavin Yamey, who was the editor, said, let's publish it as a debate. So it was a lovely debate back and forth about us trying to get our minds around that. The ag biotech people at the foundation came to us and said that they were exploring an agreement with Monsanto to enter into this consortium where Monsanto held the IP to try to develop a drought-tolerant maize. They were going to make the grant to a small biotech NGO in Nairobi, but Monsanto still held that IP and they were going to license the IP. And they were saying, look, we're nervous for all kinds of reasons, reputational reasons, to be partnering with Monsanto. The reputation wasn't particularly good at that time. And what we did then, as we worked with that team, we developed a social audit strategy and implemented that social audit around the implementation of that project. And what was really interesting about it is that the Monsanto people appreciated it more than anyone because it helped them give them a vehicle to show that they, in fact, were trying to do a good job. So that was particularly interesting. There's an Emory angle to this next one. I didn't know that at the time, but Bill Gates had gotten really interested in our lack of ability to do really good mortality assessment in children, what's causing mortality. And he was interested in minimally invasive autopsy devices for kids who had just died. And so we were asked then to prepare this 45-page report about what ethical, social, and cultural considerations should be taken into account in the design and implementation of a minimally invasive autopsy device. So we wrote this report. We submitted that to Bill's team, and they took that up, had some meetings, and this was the precursor to what ended up being about $130 million of investment to Emory in the CHAMPS program that really has made huge strides, I think, in improving our ability to do mortality assessments in children. So some lessons from this experience, and like I said, there are 150 of them, so I just shared a few of these here. The first thing that's maybe obvious is that conventional research ethics, the normal ways that we tend to think about research ethics, are just completely insufficient to provide reliable solutions to problems like these. And the viable solutions really have to be custom made. The second is that we experience, and we were speaking about this morning, there are real perils associated with the label ethics. The way I characterize it here is that there are debilitating preconceptions and major cultural challenges about speaking about ethics in science-based organizations. We did our best when we didn't talk about ethics at all. The ethics permeated everything we did. It permeated all of our reasoning, the way that we were thinking about those problems. But we just didn't talk about it, and everyone seemed happier. So there might be some deeper lesson there for Ethics Week, that we have to be careful about what we think we're presenting when we try to bring ethics into the discussion. The third point here is that it's really difficult to design a program like the one that we did. There's this interesting balance between delivering high quality advice and solutions. I mean, we were essentially set up as a consulting firm. I was the managing director of that firm, and we had 14 of us in total for about 3 or 4 years. So I had a lot of learning to figure out how to do that, and at the same time then trying to create new knowledge and contribute to the academic life, and they're not always in harmony for all kinds of reasons. And then finally, this sort of complex balance between the execution of the Grand Challenges program and what I think of as the risks of disregard of the interests of key stakeholders. In other words, not recognizing that there are people in organizations who hold legitimate interests in what it is that you're trying to do, and treating them as if they don't have those interests. There's a really important tension there. And that kind of flows into the next kind of stream of work. This is a Scientific American article called The Wipeout Gene about genetically modified mosquitoes. And the article is about my friend Tony James. And at the opening night of the Grand Challenges at a dinner in Seattle, Tony asked me this question: what's the most effective way to engage the host community for caged field trials of a genetically modified mosquito to control dengue virus transmission? I hadn't met him. We were sitting having dinner. That was the first question. Turns out he's an absolute beauty, a lovely, lovely guy. But I was like, oh my God, same answer. Tony, I have no idea. Absolutely no idea. But, we figured it out. We had to kind of go and sort of work through a whole range of issues. This is me in Tapachula in southern Mexico with some of the cages that they eventually used to do those trials. But before we got there, did a lot of work in trying to get clear about how you select that site. So much helicopter research, so much just dropping in. So we did really deep assessments in site visits, working with partners, working with collaborators, working with NGOs, with journalists to understand capacities in the sites that were candidates. And those selection processes were done, I think, really, really well. And then we did a review of existing approaches in community engagement, because that was a kind of major focus for the work. And I thought it was kind of an unremarkable paper, but it's been cited almost 500 times. And for those of you in the clinical world, that's maybe not such a big deal. In the bioethics world, that's kind of a big deal. So I'm still amazed that this paper continues to get cited. I think it's old now, and they should be citing other things. But anyway, we'll take it. And then part of what we did was we took some of that learning, and we wrote another paper where we tried to lay out what we thought were some strategy considerations about developing broader approaches to community engagement in global health research. I got a call then one morning. I was in Mexico, and one of my friends in Toronto phoned and said, "Oh, that's really nice about the call out in Nature," and I hadn't heard anything about it. But this Nature commentary said, "Look, we're doing all this work on these genetically modified mosquitoes, and here's a really promising approach to think about the community engagement." And that was our paper, and I thought, "Wow, that's exciting." And then the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, it cited it as well. And then that kind of gave me some motivation to really focus down on this as an area. So we did a whole bunch of case studies, a whole bunch of commentaries. I don't expect you to read them, just to show you that we were trying to look at a whole bunch of different areas, tuberculosis, ag, biotech, to try to get a better understanding about what community and stakeholder engagement was really about and how we could improve our practices. So that's really the transition. With all of that kind of stuff in the background, I went to Emory. And I had this notion in my mind that there was something really important about what I was thinking as the human engagement part of this, and about learning about these things in a more deliberate way. So came up with this idea of the Human Engagement Learning Platform, or HELP for Global Health. So we really focused on four main areas. One is stakeholder engagement and organizational learning, and I'll talk a bit about that. Broker design is another approach that we're developing that's kind of a co-design, co-knowledge production with a bit of a blend of our stakeholder engagement work. Some work on what we call deep contextual learning, which is about insight mapping, and then a lot of work on fair partnerships. And I think I'm just going to talk about the stakeholder engagement and organizational learning. I can't remember whether I'm talking about the broker design or not. This is how bad it is now, but we'll find out. We'll find out. It's a kind of discovery. Okay. So around the time that those papers were finishing up, I think this paper was in the mix, Scott O'Neill, who's now he's the CEO of the World Mosquito Program. He was the PI of the Grand Challenges Project on eliminating dengue. And so he asked if we would do a case study of their community engagement for their first open release trials of a biologically modified mosquito in northern Queensland in Australia. So we did that, and it turns out that it was extremely valuable for us, in part because they did a really good job. We actually had fights later when we presented this at their network meetings. Some of their investigators were saying, "You're not being tough enough, you're being too nice, why are you being so nice?" And I'm like, "No, they did a good job. We're trying to report that they did a good job." But this really kind of helped us get a first handle on what we thought might be a model for community engagement in global health. And then as I grappled with this, I was getting really frustrated with a lot of the conversation about this and a lot of divergence in the field. And so I wrote this commentary in Science, and I made these points. First of all, it's really difficult to build this an evidence base in stakeholder engagement because there's such a high degree of variability in stakeholder engagement, in the concepts that we use, in the language, in the models, where we draw things from. And we tend to have very narrow conceptualizations of this. So NIAID at NIH has done, I think, a really admirable job of promoting community advisory boards as part of prevention trials, HIV prevention trials, but it's become kind of reified into this thing, and it's quite a narrow way to think about community engagement. We've also worked with quite a lot of different communications firms in different projects, and again, there's a kind of view of community engagement as a kind of one-directional delivery of key messages. And those seemed unsatisfying to me. There's also a real lack of agreement on a coherent and comprehensive construct of stakeholder engagement, what it is and how does it work. And also a real lack of agreement on the ethical goals and value of stakeholder engagement. So this is one of those areas where I had to pull a bunch of slides. I'm not going to do deep dives in each of those areas, but we have done some really deeper thinking about that, and we have something that kind of does look like a model. And this won't be easy to see, but as the appendix in the Science paper, there's a basic framework, and that's actually a framework of questions that we are still struggling with, which is part of the trying to build an evidence base. But the basic idea here is that there's sort of foundational ideas that we need to get our minds around. And then we have planning, design, management, and evaluation problems and challenges that go all the way through these programs, and we tend to not engage with them. And the argument was, if we could do a better job of engaging with those, making them more explicit, we'd probably be able to improve things. So at that point in time, then I'm at Emory and I'm doing a talk sort of like this. And Steve Blount and Greg Nolan from the Carter Center come up to me afterwards and they say, hey, you're talking about this community engagement stuff. We got a bit of a problem in some of our work in Haiti with mass drug administration for lymphatic filariasis, and we wonder whether you'd be willing to come down and have a look at this. So the problem was that they were doing mass drug administration for the treatment of lymphatic filariasis in Port-au-Prince, in the capital, for a long time. I mean, they've been at it for, at this point, about 6 or 7 years. And what they were seeing was a year-over-year decline in coverage of the mass drug administration. And they were saying, you know, we're not really quite sure why. We're not quite sure what the disconnects are. I wonder if you could have a look at that for us. So we went down and we did a study, and you know, we do what we do as qualitative researchers. We talk to a whole bunch of people. This paper then, the title I think is helpful in terms of this part of the story. It's the roles of stakeholder experience and organizational learning in the declining mass drug administration coverage. So this is where we really first started to link up the idea that stakeholder engagement and organizational learning were really critically linked in super important ways. And I think really importantly, in ways that we need to think more about the creation of value. And so usually what we do is we look at the program inputs and mechanisms, the elements. For example, you had distribution posts, you had communications trucks, you had workers in different roles. Those are the sort of inputs on the program. What we tend to do when we're evaluating is we tend to just choose some endpoints. We jump right to the end and we look at the impact on program outcomes that we select and that we think somehow represent some notion of value, and we want to measure that. What we discovered was completely unremarkable, I think, but quite important. There were, first of all, a lot of what we characterize as mediating factors. And I'll give you the simplest one because I think it illustrates it the most clearly. We talked to people and they said, look, I went to the distribution post and it was dirty. And you think, okay, well, I mean, it's not the cleanest city in the world. Port-au-Prince was very difficult times even then. And they're saying, but it was dirty. And you think, okay, so we started to look at this as a potential modifier of that program input. So you've got a distribution post. Now, it's in part not actually functioning as a distribution post because this mediating factor of the dirty environment is actually changing someone's experience of the program. And so the way that people experience the program then also affects their reasoning about the program. And what they told us was, look, this doesn't look like the kind of place that I should be taking a mouthful of drugs. It doesn't feel like a medical or a public health setting. It feels like a kind of dirty place on the corner, and I don't want to do that. That's why I'm not participating. And so what we tried to argue in this paper is that it's really this kind of combination of the inputs, mediating factors, stakeholder experience, stakeholder reasoning, and behavior, I think that we need to think differently about as we evaluate the impact of programs. And we had 10 seconds to chat with the dean of the business school. The strategic management people do an infinitely better job of this than we do. Like, really take those aspects incredibly seriously. And I think there's an awful lot we can learn in public health from the strategic management literature in these spaces. So we, as you do as an academic, we tried to exploit some of this connection with the organizational learning. We got a Grand Challenges and Global, Grand Challenges Explorations grant to kind of take some of this reasoning and apply it in broader health campaigns. And I'm not going to say any more about that, but it's an example about where some of that progressive thinking about where the ethics lie and trying to mine that, gave us other opportunities to try to apply this in different settings. And then the lead author on that paper was my student, Brianna Wadnick, and she's now at the University of Toronto, and just published this paper a little while ago, but really starting to dig deeper into how some of this thinking and some of these frameworks, again, that are very much alive in the strategic management literature, might be applied in global health spaces and global health institutions. Okay, so just a couple more minutes. I want to just share a few of the current directions, again, that sort of follow from this this thinking about where the ethics lie and where we can, how we can sort of utilize the insights that we're getting from this work to try to make progress in other spaces. And I should say too that the examples really do sit at this interface between stakeholder engagement and organizational learning, even if they don't look exactly like that on the surface. So the first one, and this is going to be just quite quick, superficial descriptions, but the first one is mass drug administration versus antimicrobial resistance. And this is work that I'm doing with colleagues at the Task Force for Global Health in Atlanta. And the simple part of the story is that we know that if you do population level administration of azithromycin, that you can have predictable reductions in child mortality. There are problems with it, but we know pretty securely now that you can get something like, say, 12, 13% reduction in child mortality by doing mass drug administration. So what you have there is a predictable benefit. Those are hard to find in global health, and that seems like on the surface a good thing, something that you want to pursue. And so just last week, in fact, at the REACH network, the Resilience Through Azithromycin for Children network in Abuja, and my colleague David was there. I was supposed to be there, but I couldn't make that meeting. We have African leaders signing an agreement to continue to work on these issues. But of course, on the other side, what you have are people arguing that, was the trial really necessary? I mean, is this the way that we should be operationalizing our goals in global health? Shouldn't these be things that are managed by health systems? Shouldn't these things be absorbed? Or should they be done differently than mass drug administration? Completely reasonable question. And then the more specific question is about the threat of this mass drug administration, the prevalence of these drugs in their contribution to antimicrobial resistance. The reality is we don't have a really strong handle on that relationship. For example, if there is AMR, we don't know much about its durability. We don't know much about its spread. Is it a concern? Absolutely, it's a concern. So the work that we're doing, in fact, this is also funded by the Gates Foundation. The work that we're doing is to go out and kind of hang out a bit with all of these different stakeholders and get a better understanding about what interests are motivating them. What is it that they're concerned about? What are they trying to accomplish in their own spaces? And then work with them in a kind of brokered way to see if we can bring them together into some deliberative spaces to try to figure out whether there are pathways that we can go forward where we can be doing innovation, but that's kind of creating new value and not just kind of focusing those, the fights inward on each other. So really challenging, but I think it's going to be a really interesting project. And just two more. The next one is a project about vaccine equity. So after COVID, there was a lot of discussion about the ethics of vaccine distribution in COVID. Most of that conversation really focused on where bioethics usually focuses, and that's once people get vaccine, how do they distribute it? What's their prioritization scheme? What are their criteria for distributing once you have your vaccine? And we were thinking, well, that's an old problem. I mean, there's a lot of literature on that. There's a lot of thinking about those prioritization problems. There's way less thinking about the upstream problems. How do you think about you pull an mRNA vaccine out of your pipeline, and at the moment that you pull that down as a candidate for development, that you're inheriting a minus 80-degree cold chain problem. And that that's going to result in a deficit in your ability to do equitable distribution. So we wrote this piece, again, for a science policy forum piece. And in it, we sort of laid out this what we call the equity deficit cascade model. And the details don't really matter. I think it's free online as well, like this science policy forum piece. But what we did then is we took that around and we tried to get people interested in funding it to say, let's use it as a kind of empirical framework and go and see if we can investigate whether what we're thinking is actually happening. And we ended up getting funded by Pfizer. So the Pfizer Global Grants people, they have an internal program on equity, I think in part because they're getting hammered on equity. And remember what happened with Pfizer, their share price shot through the roof. The focus was on sales, 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 sales. Share price went crazy, 100% profits year over year, and then the share price dropped again. So you have this peak and trough problem with their share price. We're not actually sure what the problem is. Was the problem that they didn't solve the distribution problem, the equity problem? Do their shareholders, to their boards, are they worried about that? We're not sure. So those are some of the things that we're trying to investigate with this project. Again, we're going to be interviewing people from across the sort of global vaccine ecosystem to try to understand the decision architecture that sort of sits behind these things and where the trade-offs on these stakeholder issues related to equity may fall, and see if we can identify some pathways for making some improvements. Okay. Final one. I didn't mention any of this in the Gates Foundation work, but I've been, for a long time, I've been a board member for the Council on Health Research for Development, and one of the things that we've developed is the Research Fairness Initiative. So I've been working a lot on fair partnerships for the last few years. And so one of the things that we've been trying to put together, this was part of the Gates Foundation grant that I showed you, is this idea of fair partnerships by design. How can we get more explicit about what it means to be a fair partnership and how we can design for that and try to implement them better? And so my partner on this is David Addis and Ashley Graham and Lee Wilkers at the Focus Area for Compassion and Ethics at the Task Force for Global Health. Task Force, as most of you probably know, has just had its 40th year anniversary. It started as the Task Force for Child Survival by Bill Foege 40 years ago. And recently, this is Pat Lammy, who's the director of the CORE NTD program, so the global support program for NTD programs that's based at the task force. And they were recently awarded USAID's Ending Neglected Diseases Through Operational Research, or ENDOR Cooperative Agreement. It's a $50 million grant, a major, major grant with the goal of trying to improve NTD research in Africa. So Pat and John Amawasi had this really, really nice meeting in Ghana with their teams where they launched the program officially and sort of celebrated this kind of partnership. So what's been super interesting about this work is that Pat and John came to us and said, we want to get this right. This is a ton of money. This is a rare opportunity with this amount of money to really get the partnership built correctly. So we've been working with them in a kind of co-design brokering model to help them sort out where they see the challenges with the partnership, where they see some of those pitfalls for fairness, and we're working with them to kind of co-design the partnership in real time with them. So it's not like, here's the partnership, everyone sign it. It's a kind of process of co-discovery and co-design prospectively through this process. Again, it reaches back into some of those deeper ethical concerns about the understanding and acknowledging the interests of stakeholders and their role in the kind of partnership that you're looking at, and then how you build those insights into organizational learning opportunities. Okay, so final reflections. In the title, I was kind of cheeky or ambitious or both, and was alluding to something transformative. I have no idea whether any of this is transformative or not, but what the hell? I mean, worth just kind of putting it out there. So here are some of my kind of final thoughts on all of this. Number one, I think the dominant modes of ethics practice in global health are just inadequate to address the field's complex ethical challenges. I think that's not a crazy statement. I think that ethics really comes alive in the details and in the context, but it requires us to move beyond the recitation of principles and values. Again, we spent some time this morning talking about this, and actually engage with stakeholders. This doesn't mean that you can't have principled positions or that you don't appeal to principles and values in various ways, but it's about really finding ethical value in a deeper understanding of the interests that stakeholders hold, and the way that those interests might be seen as opportunities for creating value or for avoiding harm to stakeholders. The third point is that I think ethical reasoning can help us to identify and generate solutions to ethical challenges and should be informed by those interests and perspectives of stakeholders. And I think stakeholder engagement is a really powerful vehicle for organizational learning. In a sense, it is the vehicle for organizational learning about those interests, what matters to stakeholders, how we can solve for them, I think really is where organizational learning should be focused. And I think that many practical and ethical challenges persist in global health precisely because organizations are either unable or unwilling to learn from their stakeholders. And again, I think we should be spending so much more time with our business school colleagues because they have to do this and they're really good at it and they have deep, thoughtful literature on this, and I'd love to see more of that kind of collaboration. I'm going to end with I told you guys about the slides that I took out. This morning I asked Gemini with the Google AI, I asked Gemini to generate an image for me, and I said, show me a picture of a school of public health. And I want to see two departments. I want to see the biostatistics department and the ethics department. So generates. I said, okay, that's nice. Just now, I'd like you to distribute that according to the current ratio in my School of Public Health at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory, which is 50 to 1. 50 primary appointments in biostatistics and bioinformatics, and me, one lonely old guy trying to struggle through. And I think if there's real value in this type of ethical reasoning, we're absolutely underappreciating it, underinvesting in it, and underutilizing it in what we do in global health. So thank you so much again for the invitation, and really happy to hear any thoughts and questions that you might have. And don't point the laser at people. I think that's the number one rule. There should be a sticky note, Will, that says that. Any thoughts, questions? I guess I'll stay here so we can hear. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, thank you for the talk today. I had a question about, through your experience, what do you think makes these large organizations so unwilling to learn from the stakeholder engagement?
Yeah. So I think there's obviously long answers to that. Let me try to give you what I see as the kind of easier short ones. And when you say large organizations, I mean, I sort of see two camps, right? I see one is like corporations, and the other one is large organizations like WHO or UNICEF, who we've done some work with. I think on the corporate side, I think what we find is that whatever you do in your learning investment has to first of all solve for your business case. So if you really want to learn, if you want to invest more in learning about stakeholder interests, about how they may create opportunities for, for creating value for them or things that you might have to do differently, if you can do that within the constraints of your current budget or within your current business model, then I think that's okay. As soon as it gets more demanding and requires you to step outside the business model, I think that's where things kind of come to a halt. So I actually think that it's quite analogous in what happens in large, say, NGOs or public governments or organizations like UN organizations. It may be a slightly different logic on the business model, but they're still governed by a business model, which is about do your expenditures exceed your revenues? And how are you set up to kind of perform the functions that you're performing? Let me tell you like a brief story about UNICEF. We were interviewing senior directors from their immunization programs, and I won't say which ones, but we were interested in how they were thinking about expanding their understanding of what it means to be an effective program beyond just coverage. So if you're doing a vitamin A campaign or more than just, did you cover 80% of the eligible population? I mean, and they were thinking about different things than that. But what they said was, yeah, we just do everything exactly the same way every year. In part because that model doesn't change, the underlying model doesn't change, and the opportunities to push back on the model are more difficult than we think. We were talking this morning about teaching health systems and social justice classes, and I've been hammering away at my students that you want to have a better, healthy world, you got to fight. You got to learn how to fight. You got to learn how to assert yourself, how to take arguments, how to be deliberative. So I think there are different ways, but we're just kind of stuck in models, and they're hard to break out of. And really importantly, I think to the point, we tend to want to ascribe malice often to, say, large corporations or to government. And I think it's kind of rarely the case. Sometimes they're corrupting factors for sure, but usually it's not because people want to do bad. It's more that they're kind of stuck in a particular mode of working and have difficulty finding the time or energy or political will to kind of try to move explicitly beyond it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but. Looks like it doesn't.
Yeah.
Not the first time.
So if we're the, my question is if everybody within the organization is feeling these pressures and we just keep chugging on and on, why do we even like ask the question? Because I feel like if we are asking the question, then there is the will within the organization. And if all the people, or at least a sizable amount of the people wanted to change, like what are these forces? Because I feel like they're still human forces. These are decisions. Like it's not set in stone. These are conceptual models. Why is it so hard to get out of a conceptual model, even if you built infrastructure around it?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, your question's super important. I think it goes to the heart of a lot of things that we're trying to grapple with. Let me use the vaccine equity one as an example. Let me try that one. So, I don't know if this is true, but this is part of what we're trying to learn. Let's say Pfizer or Moderna. Right? So, as soon as they started developing the mRNA vaccines, there was discussion about equity. There was discussion about equitable distribution. There was discussion about whether or not distribution would track epidemiology, or as COVAX at WHO did, just give equal 20% proportions by population to every country. At the same time, what you have is a really highly unusual product that's got amazing potential, huge growing demand. Don't have a complete handle yet on the demand, but it looks like it's going to be enormous, and an opportunity then to drive sales. You've got countries, you've got heads of state phoning the chair saying, we want to buy 5 times our population in doses to be safe. And then to your question is, if let's say there's will within the company, let's say I'm a program director and I say we should be thinking differently, we should be distributing these equitably around the world. I don't have the final word. You might think, okay, well, maybe the CEO has the final word. Well, the CEO's got to talk to the board. And let's say someone on the board says, you know what, I think they're right. Let's take 40% of everything we produce and we'll distribute it around the world. The board doesn't have the final say. Those companies their shareholders are the world's largest pension funds. So those pension funds are saying, wait a minute, we're not sure that that's actually going to be the best return for us as your largest shareholders. So we want you to think a little bit more carefully before you start going and distributing those products differently around the world. So what you have is this kind of hierarchy of authority and decision rights that is highly influential in shaping and constraining on an organization. And I'm not a management expert, but I think those dynamics they're pretty powerful, however they work out. We're trying to understand them a little bit better. Let me recommend a book, too, that I recommended to you guys this morning. It's a woman named Sarah Kaplan. She's at the University of Toronto. And the book's called The 360-Degree Corporation. And it talks about exactly what you're talking about in your question. How do you go from these insights about ways that you might be able to do things differently, might be able to innovate? And she walks through these different modes of practice about innovating around different decision models, and talks about the kinds of constraints that you have to do and how sometimes companies have to just take leaps of faith and get that political will and get everyone lined up and do things that they might not otherwise have wanted to do and can be successful or can ruin companies. So highly recommend it, the 360-degree corporation. Thanks for the questions. They're hard ones, but they're really important.
Thank you. John McCracken from the College of Public Health. I told you a little bit about our research this morning where we're trying to improve health by changing the way people cook and the source of energy. We have community engagement in our projects, but I feel like we haven't got to the level of some of the projects that you've demonstrated. And it's often something that's added once you get, say, an R01 grant. You already have to have your aims and your research strategy very well defined. So I feel like working that way, the community engagement is really superficial, and as you've pointed out, often a small proportion of the effort is dedicated to it. And I'm wondering how you would recommend we could change that, because I don't, if you have recommendations, for example, what are the funding mechanisms of how could you put community engagement up front with a funding model like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, John, in a way, I think you've put your finger on the main problem that we have in the normal funding structures that we work within, right? And I think NIH is the kind of paradigm example. So when you go out and talk to people, let's say we're not in an R01. Let's say we're just interested in doing something like the work that you're doing. You go out and talk to people and you sort of say, let us understand better, like, what's going on with your cooking? What problems you're trying to solve? Are we on the same page even about understanding the nature of the problems you're experiencing? Would the kinds of things that we're talking about maybe be valuable for you, or potentially could they be? What might have to change? And you learn things about them, you learn things about their interests, and then often what happens, especially with the non-obvious interests that we were talking about this morning, you'll say, oh, I never thought of that. Good stakeholder engagement or community engagement, we should be responsive to that interest. That, what you just told us now, actually opens up a way for us to think differently about how we might create value for you, or how we may not do certain things that could be harmful to you. Okay, so we discover that. Let's say now we discover that in the context of the R01. What are your mechanisms for responding? Your mechanisms of responding are your budget and your protocol. And they're locked down. So what happens is most community engagement, I think, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say most, ends up being empty gestures, not because people aren't good people, but because the actual mechanisms that would allow us to be responsive are not available to us. And when we go and talk to communities, what they say is, yeah, we don't listen anymore because we know they can't do anything for us, and they come and they say, oh, we've consulted with the community. And that's exactly right. They've consulted, but they have not been responsive to those interests in constructive ways. And so we're trapped, I think, in those models. I've had this conversation at NIH. I mean, I've been trying to sort of argue this for a long time with NIH about funding models and looking at different kinds of flexibility. I think there's interest in it, but it goes back to the earlier question. As an organization, it's a non-trivial thing to try to change the way that budgets are operationalized in research. So, I mean, I think you've kind of put your finger on the challenge. So what do? Well, part of, I think, what you can do is try to get out in front of that in a time sense, like try to get in the field, try to have those conversations maybe early on in the development of those protocols. Everyone says that, but it's not easy to do. But I think that is really the trick. And I think this notion of co-design, it's become a little bit of a buzzword, but it can be quite magical if you genuinely say, like, what would you do? How would you design this? And then allow that to have some standing in those discussions. I think it can be very, very powerful. But John, I think you put your finger exactly on part of the problem.
I'm Paula Davis Allwell, also in the College of Public Health. And I was interested in you mentioned the fair partnerships. If you could just say a little bit more about what that looks like, what that model is evolving
Yeah.
into, just a little bit more.
Yeah. Thanks, Paula. I mean, in some ways, it's a kind of tragic story. The Council on Health Research for Development, CORED, started this research fairness initiative, I don't know, maybe 12, 14 years ago. And the concept was really two parts. Number one, that it was a kind of self-reflective exercise. Here's a kind of rough framework of topics and uh, issues related to fairness in partnerships that we know are fairly common. Not a very elaborate conceptual structure, but organizations then would use this to do a self-reflection about where they are in their development as a fair partner. And then the second part of the model was publishing, to say, okay, we've done this self-reflection, and now we'd like to share that with current partners, with prospective partners. We'd like the world to see where we are with our own thinking and our own self-reflection on our practices, with some emphasis on how we'd like to improve. And then the third part of that in the initial model was that if you got a whole bunch of those, let's say you got 100 of those relatively quickly, what you would have would be a learning platform. You would see how different organizations are designing around those issues, what kind of policies they're using, how they're managing those, how they're implementing them, how they're learning from them. And you would have this very, very rich kind of data source. How did it play out? TDR from WHO stepped up, did the very first very first RFI report. Glossy, they published it, put it out there, and they talked endlessly about how helpful it was for them and how helpful it was for their partners. And then we had this tiny, 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 slow trickle of other organizations. It goes back again to the earlier question. People were really, really reluctant to do the publishing part. It was a lot of work to do the self-reflection. It was a lot of work to do it authentically. But then to take that self-reflection, which may uncover some truths that are maybe uncomfortable, people didn't want to do that. And so there was this terrible lag. We thought we would get much, much more uptake. So I think as we stand now, it's something like 15 or 16 organizations over those 12 years. And the ability for us to generate like funding, because the funding really was premised on the power of that learning platform. So the tragic news is that CORED USA, we're in orderly closure now. We're folding. And I mean, our chair is Jerry Kirsch from Fogarty from NIH. We had really powerful people. We could not get the money for this. Fascinating. And I think partly it was just those blocks, and people understood that getting over those blocks was a very, very different kind of organizational innovation, and we weren't set up to kind of tackle that. So what we're trying to do is take a model, soften it a bit, and apply some of the conceptual structure to in the task force to try to apply it prospectively, and some of the learning that we did get from that with the core NTD and the Africa NTD program. And we'll kind of see whether that puts us in a different place to think about it as a model that can be transferable to other contexts. But thanks for the question. It's been painful because I think it could have been a really, really powerful approach. Good. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really, really appreciate it. Appreciate the really excellent questions and your attention. And thanks again for having me here. Go to,